Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andrea Ribeiro Hoffman, and we have a great pleasure to do today the launch of the call, the special call, the joint call for a special issue between two academic journals, Contexto Internacional, based at IRI, PUC-Rio, and Central Periphery, based at the National Incapacitatorian University of Athens. We are both universities part of a Jean Monnet network, Crisis, Equity, Democracy for Europe and Latin America. And we had this idea of doing the joint call for papers. We did this call for papers in May 2021. So it's over a year now. We are really very happy to finally now launch the papers. We had a whole, of course, proposals, and then we have the peer reviews. And now we have finally then the presentations of the papers who are finally being published in both journals. And today we'll have then the presentation of not all papers, and not all authors are present here, but we start with the papers from Region and Periphery. And to present those papers and chair the session, we have Dimitris Katsikas, who is the member from the Jean Monnet network from the university. We have also George Andreu, from also researcher from the network, but they will talk about that later. And so as we have a lot of speakers, I won't present each of you now, but we start with the papers presentations from Region Periphery, and Dimitris will then present the authors, and I'll do then next when I start with the presentations from Contexto Internacional. So I'm really happy then to give the floor now to Dimitris Katsikas for him to present then the newspaper, the journal, and the chapters will be presented today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for watching this webinar. As Andrea said, this is a joint call that we issued last year, and it has to do with the handling of the crisis, or the pandemic crisis, in two regions, Latin America and the EU, which are the focus areas of the research project. And we kind of split up the work. The Revista Contexto Internacional, published by the University of Rio, PUC, dealt with the Latin American region and periphery. By the University of Athens, dealt with the EU region. By the way, I can show you here the print issue of the journal. Our journal had, our special issue had 4 research articles plus an introductory chapter by me. Two of the authors are here, George Andreu, who is also, as Andrea said, member of the Jean Monnet project network, and he's an assistant professor at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and Athanasios Koliopoulos, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Athens. We have 2 other authors, or rather 4 authors of the 2 other articles who are not here. Athanasios Kantzaras and John Fantopoulos from the University of Athens, and Athanasios Koliopoulos, and Jenny Papadonikolaki and Kyriakos Souliotis from the University of the Peloponnese. I will say something about the papers from the missing, for the authors that could not be here with us today. And something about the issue on the whole. As I said, our issue focused on the EU and its reaction, and European member states' reaction to the pandemic. I have to, in terms of a little introduction, I have to say that the pandemic hit Europe at a bad moment. The EU and the region was recovering from the previous twin economic crisis, the global financial crisis, and the sovereign debt crisis that followed after that. And this had left a negative legacy on health and more generally welfare infrastructure of countries, member states, particularly in the south of Europe, where the countries hardest hit by the crisis. Also, there were obvious fiscal constraints in these countries, not least due to the high level of debt or ratio of debt to GDP after the crisis. So many of the member states, particularly in the south of Europe, were weakened fiscally, but also in terms of the health capacity to deal with the pandemic. Also, at the regional level, there was, despite numerous reforms and debates that took place during the crisis, in the aftermath of the crisis, there was no new fiscal capacity at the regional level or a new debt instrument that would be viable to combat, to deal with a new shock when that came. So, in a sense, the EU as a region as a whole lacked the instruments to deal with a big new shock. To make matters worse, when the pandemic hits, Europe very quickly became the epicenter of the crisis. So as soon as the virus left China, Europe was the first region that really became a hotspot of the pandemic. And again, ironically, and unfortunately, that epicenter were the countries of the south. First Italy and then Spain in particular paid a high cost, humanitarian cost during the early phase of the crisis. And now this picture, created a lot of anxiety at the time in 2020 about what are the prospects of the EU in dealing with this crisis. And this anxiety was increased in the early months, early weeks, because we had both in the health policy, but also in economic and fiscal policies, the initial reactions were not very encouraging. We had beggar than able policies, some countries closing the borders or intervening with trade flows, to safeguard medical supplies for their own systems. We had limited initiatives in terms of fiscal interventions at the beginning. So, and again, conflicts between North and South about the necessity of a new debt instrument. So, some memories of the old crisis came to mind at the very early weeks of the crisis, but hopefully, gradually, all these problems were overcame, and the EU was able to make a much stronger reaction, a more positive reaction to this crisis compared to the previous crisis, with consecutive steps, both in the way the health responses were coordinated, but also with regards to fiscal interventions. The mechanism, the culmination of which, of course, was Next Generation EU. You will hear from the authors in a while, which is very important, both because of its size as a mechanism in terms of the amounts that it makes available to member states, but also because of the details, the mechanics of how it works, which are important for European integration. So it seems, one would say, I think the general feeling one gets is that the EU did well in this crisis, or much better anyway, compared to the previous crisis. So it seems that the lesson was learned from the past crisis. But as you will see from the two authors here today, while the big picture is positive, there are many complications and shortcomings, omissions, and things are not in every respect as positive as they seem. And this is actually also the picture that comes out from the two articles that we will not hear today. The two other articles deal with the health aspect of the pandemic, the way the EU and member states dealt with the health aspects of the pandemic. And they also paint this mixed picture. So you have both positive and negative legacies from the previous crisis. On the negative side, you have the weakened health system, as I mentioned before, which, according to Hadjaras and Fandopoulos, for example, member states at the south, they find out that took the more stringent, the more restrictive measures. And they found this is not correlated necessarily with the development, the course of infection and death rates. So they attribute this potentially to an effort from these countries to try and, given the very weakened state of the health systems from the previous crisis, tried to act proactively, because if the pandemic spread heavily in the community, the health systems could not bear the burden. So proactively, they imposed very heavy restrictions to contain the pandemic, but this had a huge toll on the economy, because these countries suffered the most in terms of economic losses. On the positive side, there is evidence that previous networks developed in previous health crises, like SARS, for example, in the EU, were very important in this crisis, and they helped. They were very conducive to a fast and efficient coordination of health policies and directives and decisions about how to deal with the pandemic on the health dimension from the EU. So on the whole, I would say we had a much better reaction, obviously, compared to the previous crisis of the EU. But again, there are fine details when you look closer at things, and you will hear from the authors next about this that muddy a bit the picture. I would very, very brief comments on the next crisis that followed right after. Actually, while still the pandemic is going on, about the Ukraine crisis. So again, there we saw a very strong and united first reaction of the EU in terms of denouncing the invasion and imposing sanctions. But gradually, again, we started to see, a loss of the drive and difficulties in agreeing on how to deal with the energy crisis and the inflation crisis as a result. It's only now, actually, 6 months after the invasion, the European Commission is trying with the member states to develop a unified response to that crisis. So a complicated picture. I will stop here, and I will ask first George Andreou, who wrote a paper about the impacts of all these new changes, particularly Next Generation EU, on social cohesion, European social cohesion policy space, to tell us more about the complicated nature of the new landscape in cohesion policy in Europe.
Great, thank you, Dimitris. Thank you, Andrea. I'm very lucky, and I feel very glad participating in this webinar. Well, actually, I have presented most of my findings in the previous event in the context of this network, so I will try to be as brief as possible. I'll try to stick to the basics and to present only a few key points. So my task has been to research how the reaction of the EU to the economic impact of the crisis relates to its prior action in the field of development policies. More precisely, I tried to research the relationship between cohesion policy, one of the oldest and most generous fiscal policies of the EU, with the new fiscal instruments that were introduced, that were established in 2020 in order to combat the pandemic. I'm doing this because precisely Next Generation EU and its mission has been legitimized in the name of economic and social cohesion. So what we have officially is two very important fiscal policies of regional magnitude, of European magnitude, being legitimized and sanctioned in the name of economic, social, and territorial cohesion. Theoretically and practically, this has a lot to do with EU solidarity and with the way the EU tries to reduce different kinds of inequalities between its member states, between its regions, between its citizens. So a few comments about solidarity in the EU. Solidarity is a principle that is being mentioned in different places in the treaties, but despite that, it is a principle that has not had a lot of practical manifestations. Why? Because the EU is mostly an economic cooperation institution that focused on the establishment and the successful functioning of the internal market. And the EU relies a lot on competition and also national responsibility for economic policies, especially after the Maastricht Treaty and also the introduction of the single currency. So in this context, in the context of the economic governance of the EU, emphasis has been placed on coordination of economic policies and on the responsibility of member states to run their economies and also to run their social policies. And in this kind of arrangement, the EU does offer some signs of solidarity, but researchers have found that this kind of solidarity is of a competitive nature. We're talking about competitive solidarity or a competitive solidarity approach, on the basis of which the EU does offer some support to member states and regions in order to help them develop and address the competition pressures of the internal market, but it does so first in a rather limited form, in terms of generosity. It does not dispose of huge amounts of money compared to member states. And secondly, this type of solidarity mostly finances different types of investment and not entitlements. So we're talking about a distributive rather than a redistributive policy. That's all about solidarity for the time being. Let me focus now on the concept of cohesion, a very nebulous and imprecise concept. Nobody really knows what it is about. Traditionally, through the development of cohesion policy, cohesion came to be associated with regional development and combating spatial and regional inequalities between the EU member states and regions. So far, the operational definition of cohesion is a policy that addresses territorial, interregional, international inequalities. So reducing the levels of disparities between different countries. And despite of the adjective social added to the term, no working definition of social cohesion exists anywhere in the EU. No official position as to that, what social cohesion might mean. Now, cohesion policy, as it has been called, is a very complex set of different financing instruments that has been installed since the late 80s. It is a policy that has had a long history. It has been connected with aspects and phases of European integration, like the Southern enlargement and the single market in the 80s, the EMU in the 90s, the Eastern enlargements in the years 2000, and then new developments in the EU, and also tradition continues in the sense that cohesion has also been linked with fighting or combating the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, cohesion policy, as I told, focuses on investment and on co-financing regional and national development plans. In the last 2 decades, however, cohesion policy has been more and more linked with the economic governance of the EU and with the need of member states to pursue the correct economic and fiscal policies in order to manage their economies in the desired way under the EMU policy framework. And this kind of strategization of cohesion policy, this is one of my main arguments, has had a negative impact in terms of complexity and also in terms of clarity. So goal congestion and complexity have been growing when it comes to organizing and managing all these development programs under the name of cohesion. Now, I don't have a lot of time, so I'll say things as briefly as possible. Now, in 2020, it was decided that the EU is going to develop 2 different sets of policies under the name of cohesion. The first set of policies constitutes the old cohesion policy, the traditional cohesion policy that has remained more or less unchanged in relation to the past, and unchanged both in terms of budget and in terms of mission and objectives and management methods. And on top of this old cohesion policy, Next Generation EU has been added, a very generous fiscal instrument, the centerpiece of which is the so-called Recovery and Resilience Facility that finances national recovery and resilience plans. This is a sizable fiscal instrument of temporary nature. It is supposed to expire by the end of 2026. And it has a very important role to play in national development and in national economic policies in the current years. This new instrument, Resilience and Recovery Facility, consists of both grants and loans. and it focuses mostly on two main priorities: green transition and digital transition. So health issues and social issues are also funding priorities, but are of a second order. They follow these two main priorities that have been laid out in the new regulations, in the new documents that regulate the function of this new instrument. And officially, the general objective of this new instrument is to promote economic, social, and territorial cohesion, and some more details to that extent are being provided. Cohesion is going to be promoted by combating the crisis, by promoting the European Pillar of Social Rights, by supporting green transition, other climate targets, and the goal of climate neutrality, also goals including economic and social convergence, sustainable growth, integration of the economies of the Union, high quality employment, creation of a whole range of public policies that cover practically everything, different kinds and sorts of distributive, redistributive, and event stabilization policies. And as a result of that, we have the emergence of what I call a cohesion and resilience policy space, which is far more complex than the old cohesion policy space, because now it involves both the old and the new policy. And this complexity can be seen both at the level of goals and both at the level of instruments. I don't have any time to explain any of this moving forward. And as a result, this reform that took place in the EU budget in 2020 is a very significant reform, since it introduced big changes, the most important of which has been, of course, Generation EU. This is a very generous instrument. It has been placed under an old principle, which is not fully compatible with its goals, or that was, at least that was the standard interpretation before its introduction, because we're talking about an instrument that focuses on national development and national recovery, and that prioritizes non-territorial goals like the green transition and the digital transition. So cohesion policy is becoming ever more complex, and there is this big discussion about whether cohesion is kind of a byword or a kind of a wallet for any EU policies or goals. And in terms of the new instruments prospects, it is a very important, very generous instrument, but it's a temporary one. It does not amount to the creation of a permanent central fiscal capacity for the EU. It does not introduce new types of solidarity. It's repeating the EU's old commitment, or the commitment to cohesion. It does not have a clear-cut social dimension, and it focuses on investment strategies and much less on entitlements. So in this respect, we can argue that this new instrument is very much compatible with the traditional competitive solidarity approach that has been applied in the EU in the last decades. So this is a very important but transitional and incomplete reform, in my view. And I think that the next negotiations about the future long-term budget of the EU are going to be even more crucial than the last ones, because this is going to be the time when the EU member states and the EU institutions are going to decide how many of these novelties are going to keep up and enhance the next period, and how many of them they're going to leave behind as temporary. And actually, the big question is what kind of fiscal policies the EU is going to develop in the future. This question is still open. I'm finishing here. I don't have any time, and perhaps I will be able to say a few things afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. And we move on to Thanasis Koliopoulos, researcher at the National Competition University of Athens. We will talk about the legitimacy aspects, if you like, of this new instrument, New Generation EU. Thanasis, the floor, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Professor Katsikas. Good evening or good morning, everybody. Can I share my presentation? Just a minute. Sorry, I have a problem, probably. Okay. Professor Katsikas, can I send the presentation to your mail to share this?
Yeah, perhaps you should open it first and then share. Is it open?
No, that's not.
But you can send it to me, yeah. Let's try that.
Okay.
And you can start if you like, and I will open it in due time. If I can.
I think he's sharing the full computer. You know, the first thing is the full computer, because we are seeing the email. There is an option that you can share just PowerPoint. But anyway.
Okay, send it. Let's start. As said,
Thanasis, just answer we are seeing your screen. Answer the screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
As said Professor Andreu before me, the EU Recovery and Resilience Facility lies at the heart of the Union's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the important is that access to this funding was subject to submission of national recovery plans in which member states laid out what reforms and investments would be supported by the RRF. And final, payments are dependent on completion of final targets and milestones in or before August 2026. We can see the second slide that member states should, as a rule, have officially submitted their recovery and resilience plans by the 30th April 2021. However, this deadline was flexible. In this context, this presentation tries to address the following question: whether drafting national plans is an opportunity for strengthening EU legitimacy. Most member states face a tough policy dilemma. While it should be in everyone's interest to disburse recovery fund as soon as possible, it is equally important to ensure adequate time for political participation. And to address our research question, this presentation, this paper is based on secondary data collected based on several relevant surveys on the stakeholder involvement, that is civil society organizations and local and regional governments. And we can see in this slide some of these surveys. An important fact is that stakeholder involvement is neither a legal requirement nor one of the assessment criteria by the Commission. As a result, legitimacy issue in the European Union is raised again. Theoretically, EU-focused studies of democratic theory identify three legitimacy concepts. First one is the output, effectiveness, and performance of EU policies. The second is the input, responsiveness to citizens' political demands and concerns. And the third one is the throughput quality of EU policy-making processes. Prior to the Eurozone crisis, the EU appeared to benefit from effective output and throughput legitimacy due to the overall welfare generating effect. With the beginning of the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone in 2008, governmental authority was deemed less significant than technocratic, since technical approaches to output legitimacy were seen as more important. As a result, a vast majority agenda, a vast reform agenda for some member states was endorsed in the form of structural reforms into the Memoranda of Understanding. In order to avoid countries defaulting, disbursement of loan installments was subject to the implementation of MOUs. Hence, there was an increasing tendency for EU funds to be steered towards member states based on conditionality, on strict conditionality. The new RRF is no exception in its use of conditionality. However, this scrutiny differentiates from the conditionality attached to the MOU reforms. We have a new kind of conditionality, a light conditionality. As we can see from the conclusions and findings from several reports about the engagement of stakeholders in drafting national plans, the most important conclusion is that there was little proactive government-led consultation or engagement of civil society organization, social partners, regional and peripheries in European Union. For example, we can see that the engagement of civil society organization, except for Portugal and Italy, was too limited in drafting national recovery plans. And this legitimacy concern is depicted by a Eurobarometer survey, which shows that only 44% said they believed their own governments would use this EU money properly. In general, except for public distrust, the preparation of the draft plans triggered also political turmoil in two major countries. In Italy, where coalition government of Giuseppe Conte collapsed in mid-January 2021, And in Spain, where the socialist government managed to secure parliamentary support for the plan thanks to the far-right Vox in January 2021. To sum up, despite the greater degree of national ownership of the reform plans, the vast majority of member states have not developed systems for consulting with their citizens through national and regional organizations. In light of the above consideration, the light conditionality attached to RRF plans, coupled with the low stakeholder involvement, seems once again to raise legitimacy concerns. As a result, although national recovery plans were presented as an opportunity to increase stakeholder ownership, their drafting process seems to be a missed opportunity for strengthening EU legitimacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Thanasis. Well, it was a bit weird with
Yes.
with me handling the presentation. Well, I think that's it from us here. Over to you, Andrea.
All right. So we said we could do a brief Q&A if there is specific things about both papers, and then of course we have a larger Q&A later on because we have now 5 presentations about Latin America, and then we can of course go back to issues that are addressed in both regions. But we could have a round here of Q&A. I mean, we have some attendees here, but also from the speakers, the authors. Maybe I could just pose one question while perhaps some people bring other issues, is that because of course one of the points that we've been discussing in the network is that the role of crisis. Now we have this network started researching the economic financial crisis in 2008, and of course we have been following now well, the COVID crisis. It was not even originally a topic of research, but then we engaged with that. So we and Dimitris talked about Ukraine crisis as well. So I mean, for the special issue, of course, is we focus on COVID. I think the question that is valid for these 2 presentations, but broadly also for the later, is the role about this crisis, because of course a crisis has always a cost. I mean, a crisis because there are costs. The financial crisis was majorly economic, but the COVID crisis, of course, the numbers of deaths, and I think in the case of Latin America, it was even more critical. It's very directly there. So, but still, I mean, the reflection has been to what extent for regional organizations, when one of these crises is defined as a crisis and is addressed as a crisis, what are, to what extent these regional organizations have proposals and they manage to be effective, and to what extent they are legitimate, as Thanasis brought, but also to what extent it is seen as an opportunity to increase either legitimacy, output, input, or somehow improve the situation to before the crisis. So the question is, I think you both address that in a way. I mean, you're both bringing elements, critical elements to the post-crisis COVID crisis. We are in a bit of a post-COVID crisis. So what would you be your take on that? I mean, so the COVID crisis, the EU addressed the crisis, had some probably areas, both in the economic impact or health impact. And overall, I mean, do you think that the EU managed to got stronger in the sense of the, if you've taken the multi-level governance, I mean, or are national states now more in handle of those crises? And Of course, in Latin America, we see that's a completely different story, but since the EU has a lot of policies and issued a lot of policies, I mean, I would have this question. I don't know if someone else wants to bring something. There is someone from the, there is someone asking, Miguel, perhaps, can you put the question from the public? Open for the person to ask. Amanda Cruz, do you have a question? The micro is closed.
Sorry, no, please. I'm just hearing here.
But you can make your question.
I didn't ask for the question. I don't know what happened.
Oh, okay, sorry. So
I'm sorry.
okay. So anyone else with a question now for Thanasis or George?
Okay,
so maybe if you can address that point.
Okay, so this is a very, very interesting question, the billion-dollar question. What has been changing in the EU, and what is going to be the impact for European integration? I think there is a concept that helps us approach this question in a more structured way. Dimitris has mentioned that in his introduction to the special issue. This is the concept of the EU failing forward. And this concept refers to the EU's tendency, the member states' tendency, when they work together in the Council or the European Council, to adopt solutions to problems, solutions that are inadequate, because mostly they reflect the lowest common denominator, and they're not as ambitious or as effective as a lot of people would have wished. But these solutions at the same time address some of the most urgent needs risen by crisis. And at the same time, these temporary solutions create the opportunity or the preconditions for another crisis to erupt. And this new crisis in turn is going to ask for a new temporary solution that is going to be again suboptimal, and it's going to be another kind of failing forward. And I think that when it comes to the economic impact of the COVID crisis, there are some strong elements of this kind of approach in the EU's response, because we should not talk only about the EU budget and the next generation EU. The EU, as Dimitri has mentioned, has adopted a series of decisions impacting not only fiscal policy, but also monetary policy, and decisions that are also related to the freedom of national governments and member states to use their own budgets in order to combat the crisis. Now, as an outcome of all these decisions, member states have been allowed to increase spending and increase public deficits and public debts in order to address the main needs, the main economic needs risen by caused by the pandemic. As a result of that, of course, the economic and the social impact of the pandemic has been mitigated. But at the same time, very big deficits and debts have been accumulating. And the stability and growth pact has been temporarily suspended. So the question arises, what is going to happen after the crisis is over, or when we will discuss the possibility of regenerating putting back in function the stability and growth pact. So member states and national governments are going to have accumulated excessive debts that they will not be able to manage. So a new solution is going to be needed, a new intervention is going to be needed in order for the EU to combat this crisis. And this need for spending is increasing, as you can understand, both because of the Ukraine crisis and the energy crisis, and also because of the very commitments that the EU has introduced through the Next Generation EU, like the green transition and the digital transition. So lots of financing needs, not enough money to cover these needs, and national debts and deficits accumulating. So this is a scenario for a future crisis that is waiting to happen, in my view. I'm stopping
Thank you, George. Athanasius and Dimitris, do you want to add something before we move to Latin America?
Athanasius first, I have a comment to make, but
Okay. Yes. A short comment that all the economic effort of the European Union in the aftermath of the coronavirus crisis has a mixed legacy. Concerning the economic governance, we can say that, okay, the next generation and the RRF is a temporary mechanism that cannot complete the economic, the European economic governance, and so this weakness of the economic structure and is remaining. And as far as the legacy on the legitimacy the European Union, we can say that also have some concerns, as I explained before, about the engagement of the citizens, of the social partners in drafting of national plans. And this is a very concerning point because of a general distrust of European citizens towards European institutions, that is depicted by the survey of Eurobarometer. And sorry, I have a problem. My connection is unstable.
We can hear you well.
Okay. Yes. And as I said, the legacy on the legitimacy issue in the European Union is a very crucial point for the political and economic stability in European Union.
if you allow me, Andrea, I'll make a couple of points. Well, I think legitimacy issue is important because of the political developments we see across member states. We see again, well, more generally after the crisis and during the crisis, we saw a rise in populist parties, extreme right-wing parties, rather radical parties, and we see this continuing now, still today. So, you know, to the degree that some of the policies of the EU are suffering for legitimacy, this makes matters worse. Although I would, as I said before, I would think, at least this is my opinion, that on the whole, the damage done to the trust of the EU during the previous crisis was somewhat remedied during the pandemic because of the Next Generation EU and the vaccine strategy as well. Now, again, the picture is mixed, as George says. We had all these instruments and these challenges in the future. What I would say to your question, Andre, is that although we had, again, the bag is mixed. Although we had obviously made some steps forward with all these mechanisms, if you look at the decision-making process, again, intergovernmentalism was dominant even during the pandemic crisis. It was only when Germany shifted its position and allied with France and put forward a common proposal in spring 2020 when the tables really turned, and we had this road free forward for the next generation EU. Up to that point, we kind of get the old conflicts of the previous crisis returning. So it is crucial the stance of specific key member states. And by the way, we saw also the rise of other stringent member states that took the place of that Germany previously had, like Netherlands, for example, or Finland. And this continues today. If you look again, the delay in responding to the energy crisis is again because there are many major differences in national interests across EU member states. So there are very different economic models, different energy dependency from Russia, and so on. So we see that again today, and the only way forward again is going to be if we have a intergovernmental agreement among major players. On the other hand, it is my belief that some of the aspects of the next generation EU mechanism, will be very difficult to reverse, like the own ceilings increase, and the fact that we have now a common issuance of bonds, of debt, and so on. So this will be very hard that years to come to just roll them back. They will need a majority. So I think this will create indirectly, the next steps for going forward. But again, everything is going to be intergovernmental, particularly as George said, major challenges will be coming next years on how to manage things. And just one final thought about the international aspect, because you said about Latin aspect of the pandemic in Latin America. One of the most important aspects of EU's reaction was the vaccine strategy, which procured in common vaccines and distributed it to Europe in a per capita basis, not per GDP or whatever, which is what happened globally. So, and this is an interesting point for in the regional relations. I mean, Europe did what was best for its citizens, but in doing so, actually worsened the situation, at least in the first phase of the pandemic, in regards to the availability of vaccines for the other regions in the world. More generally, the developed world bought many times over its population vaccine doses, thereby creating a shortage for other regions. So you have a kind of conflict between regional welfare versus global welfare, and how do you resolve this kind of conflict? I think this is an interesting topic of further research.
Thank you, Dimitris. Definitely. I mean, I think this is one of the issues that we are constantly debating now when we do comparative regionalism, but also cooperation between regions. And of course, within each region, we have our asymmetries. And even in the best case scenario, when the region manages to address them, it's excluding the rest. And I think in the COVID, it's one of the examples of this dilemma. How can the region provide for the region itself in a global crisis? It was a crisis really globally dramatic. So it's kind of when you see, but I think we'll have the chance to discuss that, I think, especially after the last presentation today from Bruno, who will address the EU lack cooperation and interregionalism during COVID. But thank you. I mean, of course, it would be better to have 3 hours or more even to continue discussing, but we still have 3 presenters now. So I think we stop here and move then to the presentations of the papers from Contexto Internacional, which address Latin America. And then we have a second round of Q&A. If you can stay, of course, it will be great. Although we know that it's 5 hours difference in Greece right now, but let's see. All right, so we have at Contexto, we have 5 chapters, 5 articles, 3 articles that were dealing more with more traditional approach of regional comparative regionalism, meaning addressing Latin American region organizations from Mercosur, or even in that sense also CELAC, Pacific Alliance. And we have an article by Claudia and co-authors, Isabella Gostinelli and Rafael de Souza, who are not here, talk about the OIS, which is in the region organization. It's a region organization as well, despite not having the economic integration, of course. So we start with we're going to start with the paper by Kai Lehmann, who is about South American regionalism, but he had some connections problems. He was here, he left. In case he managed to come back, then we move him later. So we start now with the paper. It's also co-author paper by Guilherme Ferreira, who's here and presenting the article on Latin American Caribbean region organizations facing the COVID-19 pandemic, but also co-authored with Karina Mariano and Jamil Bressan. I'm sure you'll talk about that. So I give you the floor now, Guilherme. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. I will share my presentation and are you seeing it?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And as Andrea said, this paper was written by me and Karina Mariano and Regine Bressan. And well, I prepared just a brief presentation to show some key points of the paper. And for now, I just want you invite everyone to read the paper after its publication. In the paper, we analyzed the response of 3 region organizations, Mercosur, the Andean community, and the Caribbean community. And our goal was try to understand what were the main elements, specifically institutional ones, that determined the adoption of regional coordination in the strategies to face the pandemic and its effects. In the paper, we first present a brief literature review discussing how the topic of health has been approached in the regionalism agenda, because, well, we consider it's not a core theme in the regionalism agenda. So we try to understand what were the questions, the variables, in order to build our analytical framework. And in the table, we have a kind of to sum up our analytical framework. And from it, we investigated the 2 main dimensions of the response to COVID pandemic by Mercosur, Andean community, and CARICOM. On the political institutional aspects, we evaluated if the region organization had an institutional structure dedicated to health issues and if it has autonomous decision-making capacity. Then we evaluated whether and how the health agenda has been incorporated into the region organization, if there was an explicit reference to the promotion of health policy in the region organization treaties and goals, or if the health agenda appears as a secondary theme, derived from trade discussion, regulations, and others. Then we evaluated if the response to the pandemic was headed by a member state, or there was some kind of leadership by a non-member state or other kind of external actor. It's what we call in the table regional governance mode. And finally, if there was some kind of action history in health crisis during the history of the organization, and to what extent this experience impacted the performance of the organization during the COVID-19 pandemic. Then on the action regarding COVID-19 pandemic dimension, we evaluated if the region organization was able to coordinate a regional strategy to respond to the pandemic. And to do so, we took into account 3 main parameters that were graded according to the relative protagonism of the region organization compared to isolate measures adopted by its member states' governments. In that dimension, we investigated if the region organization built any kind of mechanism to monitor and or exchange information between its member states, such as medical data, trade and tourism rules, and others. Then we investigated if the regional organization had any role in coordinating the distribution of medical resources, such as medical staff, hospital equipment, medication, vaccines, and others. And finally, if the regional organization represented their member states in negotiations with third parties, other governments, international organizations, and the health private sector, especially during the vaccine negotiations. As a result, our paper shows that the Andean community and CARICOM cases evidence how the existence of an institutional organ that with a specific mandate to develop regional health policies, to deal with external actors, and to stimulate cooperation has made it possible to adopt a regional strategy to fight the pandemic, especially given the economic fragility and weak domestic health systems of its members. Both organizations, the Andean community and CARICOM, were relatively successful in coordinating health strategies, promoting technical and financial cooperation, determining regional protocols for medical and economic activities, articulating community participation in the COVAX consortium, as well as coordinating the capture and distribution of financial resources and external medical supplies. Differently from that, Mercosur has only a consultative institution to deal with health issues, the Work Subgroup 11 and the Meeting of Health Ministers, which made the action of the organization vulnerable to the disagreement between its member states' governments. Specifically, we noted that the political divergence between the presidencies of Brazil and Argentina was decisive for Mercosur's inability to build a regional response to the pandemic. And in this lack of the coordination, it's important to note that the absence of Brazilian traditional leadership left kind of a gap in Mercosur's capacity to encourage cooperation and to finance regional policies. So to sum up, our conclusions indicate that those organizations which had specific institutional channels dedicated to health issues with decision-making capacity or at least some degree of autonomy, and that had already faced other health crises, have had less difficult in coordinating their member states' action and adopting regional policies. Additionally, it's important to note that the presence of leadership showed to be an important factor to promote regional cooperation and joint policies, even when it was headed by a non-member state or external actor. And for example, we have the action of the European Union in cooperation with CARICOM, and also the action of China governments in the Caribbean. Well, I think those are the key points of the paper, and I thank you all for the attention.
Thank you, Guilherme. Thank you very much. We also have an analysis in Lorena's paper, who's not also present here, about the Pacific Alliance. I can add something also later on in the Q&A. But she has a very similar analysis about Mercosur as well as you, right? So we move now then to Cláudia Marconi, the co-author paper with Isabella Agostinelli and Rafael de Souza about the normative emergence of death in the Organization of American States, responses to COVID-19 towards a regional governance of death. And it's a very interesting paper, very original in a way. And so, Cláudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to start by thanking the co-auditors of this joint special issue, Professor Andrea and Professor Dimitri. Thank you for your joint open call, and also for this synchronous current presentation and debate session, in spite of all, logistical constraints. I think that you made a really important effort and movement in this agenda. I also pay my compliments here to all my colleagues involved in this issue for their shared reflections and insights. As Professor Andrea said, I'm here on behalf of my very special co-authors, Isabela Agostinelli dos Santos and Rafael de Souza Nascimento Miranda, in order to give you all a very brief overview of our article, subsuming an invitation for reading and comment on it now or later by mail and other ways. So since the very beginning of this research, we have been really stimulated to identify some regional institutional responses to the COVID-19 crisis coming from the Organization of American States in order to recognize their substance and their format, and also the impact of these responses in terms of the imperative of death. But our main frame was to follow an urgent need to recognize and acknowledge the unequal global geographies of death that the COVID-19 recreated in our region. Some of the documents conceived by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, acting through a coordination unit rapidly installed in the very first phase of the pandemic, simultaneously pointed to an apparent, emergent, or new prohibitive model of regional governance, one that places death at the center of Organization of American States policymaking, to the extent that, for example, it condemned burying large number of human remains in common graves, especially without appropriate identification, the absence of protocols for migrants to be able to contact and also find family members under the crisis, the inability to accept bodies and corpses due to lack of space in cemeteries, for example. And secondly, we noted an intimacy between the Organization of American States and this death grammar or this death repertoire, suggesting that our research would need to mobilize some critical methodological apparatus. Our choice was the Foucaultian genealogical method in order to be able to answer the question, how does death really come into OAS politics? Or putting it differently, how is OAS related to death as a politically infused international issue and consequently demanding political and policy responses of various actors in multi-level dimensions. So having put that, let me tell you how we structured the discussion within the article beyond this introductory section. The first section of the article was in fact designed in order to put the literature that falls under the interdisciplinary field and umbrella term of death studies in contact with a delayed, even though key, effort and quest for spatializing and politicizing death in international relations. Very complex concepts understood by us as social constructs have been presented and debated, as well as the delayed reception of international relations as a discipline to death and death-making phenomena problematized. The concepts of geography of dying and death, even not owing a consensual meaning, lead us to the material, political, and contingent aspects of death and death-making, evoking not only a close look to vulnerability elements of certain groups exposed to death, but also eliciting us to dig into historical realities and how these have created the landscapes of deaths that unfold in the Americas. In this sense, a second section of the article strives to consider death directly as an analytical category by focusing on our regional experiences with mass death and mass victimization in terms of experiences of traumatic ambiguity. This is a very important concept also, and makes the link between the first and the second section of the article. The ambiguous nature of death in the region, rebirthed under the context of COVID-19 here, required a close examination of a Latin American category of desaparecidos. In English, we would say the disappeared, and the experience of death without a body, and also the experience of death without adequate rites of passage. It was through the genealogical inquiry, it was possible to indicate the forced disappearances in the region, historically dealt by Organization of American States, was a fundamental part of our specific regional deathscape, and also OAS past present responses to death making in the region have been informed by this idea. Finally, in our last section, the article provides, oh, I'm sorry, I think, oh no, it's okay. I'm just skipping to the last part, maybe the most empirical one, because we were dealing with, these aspects in a very much more theoretical aspect. But in this final section, the article provides a multi-level understanding of Organization of American States regional governance model, targeting its responses to COVID-19 and their repercussions in terms of regional state actors' strategic behavior, focusing on Brazil, Mexico, and the United States. By comparing the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights reports from 2015, 2020, a continuum of vulnerability and violences was detected, and death appears framed by this double V, vulnerability and violence. In the light of COVID-19, a multi-level governance of vulnerabilities, though, proved to be insufficient in a sense. So our main aim was to demonstrate that death seems finally begin to be internationally politicized, and Organization of American States has played a distinct role on it, even though OAS's response to COVID-19 has not to be definite in relation to guarantee the emergence of a sort of regional governance of death. Besides a well-established normativity in dealing with enforced disappearances, has proven genealogically significant in terms of the reemergence of deaf grammar in the region, contemporarily being channeled by OAS. It's still to be seen if the contact of international institutions guided by this first effort of OAS will prove to be consistent. It was interesting, for instance, to identify that some practical guides published by OAS regarding deaf rights were previous than responses coming from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. So that's it, I think, for now. It's just an overview of our, insights and contributions, hoping that you can, engage in reading the article and giving your impressions and comments on this very initial research, but with fruitful, I think, potential to move, for instance, to a compared analysis in terms of European institutionalities and this OAS institutionality. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claudia. And I think it's in fact this research. Now, as I said, I think called attention to one, I think one aspect that it's less normally addressed. And I found it fascinating because just to put in perspective, now the US and Brazil are among the 3 top countries in terms of deaths. And I was just checking here again, the US was first with 1 million deaths, 1 million people died from COVID in the US. And second came India with 528, with 730, and Brazil third with 685. So we saw, we were constantly seeing deaths in the news daily. I mean, and I think this impact and this research, I think I have more in the Q&A, but just to put in perspective, it was the 2 countries in the OAS who were responsible to more deaths in a short period. But anyway, we come back later to discuss more of that. So I now give then the floor to Bruno Luciano, who worked about the interregional level with the paper about EU, Latin American Caribbean interregionalism during COVID-19 pandemic, addressing then the cooperation and relations in general between the EU and Latin America. So Bruno, thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you everyone for organizing this very interesting event. I also thank the Contexto editors and reviewers for accepting my paper. Yeah, as Andrea already mentioned, the paper has a slightly different focus than previous papers, as I was not really focusing on one particular region organization and its responses to COVID crisis, but I was more interested in seeing the impact of the pandemic on EU-LAC interregionalism, right? So the paper is entitled EU-LAC interregionalism during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as my colleagues already mentioned, right, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown a variety of responses from countries of the 2 regions, ranging from moments of denialism, and that has a lot to do with already what Claudia mentioned, but also there's some cases of concrete regional health cooperations, such as in the case of Europe, and some cases that Guilherme and my colleagues presented. And then this article in particular aims to assess how these reactions, the various reactions, have impacted EU-LAC interregional relations, considering these multiple and sometimes incompatible approaches taken by national and regional actors when dealing with the COVID crisis. Right, so I depart from what José Antonio Sanau identified as 2 opposing responses to the health crisis in both continents. One of them considered by him as epidemiologic nationalism, and the other one is epidemiologic cosmopolitanism. And my argument, departing from these categories, is that the existences of these contrasting approaches, coupled with previous institutional and political challenges faced by regional cooperation between EU and LAC and Latin America, have in fact undermined the convergence of national health policies into regional or even interregional ones, right? And also impacting the promotion of more multilateral and interregional responses in this pandemic scenario. And my article is organized in 3 parts. The first part, I try to highlight some of the institutional and political features of EU-LAC relations before the pandemic. And then in the second part, I look at EU-LAC responses to COVID, highlighting these variants in terms of regional and national responses in both sides of the Atlantic. And then the third part is pretty much trying to respond how EU-LAC actors have tried to cooperate in the context of the pandemic, and to what extent the pandemic has affected EU-LAC interregionalism. And on the first part, just want to highlight some key features. So the main one is about EU-LAC interregionalism that we have to have in mind before looking at what happened in the pandemic with this particular dimension, is that the its main institutional feature is the existence of a multi-level and overlapping partnerships between the European Union and Latin American Caribbean countries. This is, for instance, represented by the EU's strategic partnerships set with Latin America as a whole, and then replaced to CELAC as a regional organization, or kind of representing the region. But you also have strategic partnerships with individual countries, such as with Brazil and Mexico. And on the other side, you also have the EU negotiating trade agreements and association agreements with sub-regional organizations such as Mercosur, SICA in Central America, but also you also have individual negotiations such as with Chile, with Mexico, and you also have EU single member states moving on with individual relations with specific Latin American countries, right? So this is kind of a very overlapping scenario that you have. And on the other hand, this feature has given great flexibility to EU-LAC interregional cooperation over the past year, for example, allowing this development of partnership with different geometries. But it also leads to some overlaps and divergency of agendas in several of those dialogues, because they are comprised of different set of members, and sometimes there is also they also may undermine interregional regional coordination on certain issues. And I think this is crucial to understand EU-LAC relations under COVID times. Another feature is that when it comes to the pillars of EU-LAC relations, and according to the European Union, they are focusing on trade, political dialogue, and sectoral cooperation. And these pillars, they have different sizes depending on each dimension of EU-LAC relations you're looking at. For instance, given the low level of institutionalization between the EU and CELAC forum and these more comprehensive interregional relations among them, and the fact that CELAC is a rather coordination forum rather than really a regional organization, as the other organizations that my colleague were covering their studies. So EU-LAC interregional, more comprehensive agenda focus more on the political dialogue side, and especially on consensus topic for both regions, such as migration, climate change, and gender equality. Reversely, when you look at more specific agendas, then you see that EU-LAC relations at the sub-regional and bilateral levels, this is usually when LAC countries and the European Union have stronger competences to act in certain issues. So for instance, trade dimension here comes out quite clearly, especially when we look at the agreements, for instance, signed by the EU with, for example, the EU-Mexico Modernization Agreement, signed in 2018, still under implementation, and the same logic could be applied to the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement in 2019, signed but still also under legal revision process. So these are more concrete examples of the dynamics coming from EU's relation with individual countries or sub-regional organizations. And finally, a key issue here is when it comes to the global projection of this par-regional partnership, then most authors highlight the idea that EU-LAC relations have been guided by principles and norms traditionally shared by the two regions and promoted by them in international forums such as the United States, United Nations, and WTO. And in this respect, the two regions have frequently expressed their identification with key values such as peace, democracy, human rights, trade liberalization, gender equality, respect for international law, and the promotion of multilateralism. And those support and how they are not really taken for granted when you look at the particular responses from some countries in Europe and in Latin America. They also have some repercussions when it comes to the context of the pandemic. Then the second part, I'll just cover more briefly because again, my colleagues specifically mentioned, right, reactions from some governments, especially some region organizations in Europe and Latin America. I just want to highlight that there's mixed responses coming from some denial positions. The case of Brazil, for example, is the most representative in the sense, but also isolated national responses in some cases. You also can find cases of ineffective regional coordination. And I think Guilherme's article goes alongside this nuanced perspective of how different regional organizations in Latin America have been presenting different levels of responses, right? So some ranging from more ineffective regional organizations, while others such as CARICOM, but I would also put SICA on that table. They also have presented some proactive regional cooperation. And this has pretty much to do with this idea of epidemiological nationalism. So some countries have presented a more nationalist, individualist, anti-multilateralist, and in some cases negationist view towards the pandemic, and that not only had repercussion in terms of the number of deaths we've seen, and I think Claudia stressed that dimension quite clearly, but it also means what is the capacity to promote interregional cooperation when you have certain countries that actually in recent years have gone in a completely different position regarding how they understand the role of multilateral and regional institutions in terms of dealing with concrete regional public policies. And I think it's, yeah, I mean, and you have plenty of cases, right, ranging from that. So in this term, in this idea of epidemiological nationalism, I think good examples is the Brazilian government contesting WHO recommendations, for example, supporting anti-lockdown protests, leaving the responsibility to deal with pandemic to state governors. Initially, Mexico also overlooked the pandemic, and especially the use of masks. That position has changed over time. You could also mention the case of in Hungary, where the pandemic, the government actually instrumentalized the context of the pandemic to acquire more executive powers by indefinite times, and there's a quite good connection here of pandemic and illiberal governments in Europe. You could also say the same about some positions taken by countries in Latin America, especially Brazil. And especially, I think the most at the first in the initial months of the pandemic, the most common response wasn't really regional cooperation, was the development of isolated national plans to address the COVID pandemic. And this could also be seen in the case of the European Union. The initial responses came from member states, and over time the EU took a more coordinated and stronger positions, exactly because the different competences in terms of who is actually able to do something in terms of health policies, right? And then, yeah, you have failed attempts coming from ProSub, for example, and this has a lot to do with the death of UNASUR Health Council some years before the pandemic, and that was a pity because South America had at some point really a competent and functioning body that could actually contribute a lot to regional cooperation in health. And you also have different responses from other organizations. So minor responses from Mercosur, as Guilherme already mentioned, and you have some major responses from other organizations such as SICA, CARICOM. They had a more comprehensive and swift response to the pandemic. And for instance, the case of CELAC is also there's a later response. For example, I couldn't cover it in my paper because I wrote before. Actually, the Mexican presidency of CELAC support, for instance, the CEPAL's proposal on a plan for self-sufficiency in health matters in Latin America and the Caribbean, and issue a declaration later last year on this. But then again, yeah, this just came out more later on, showing that the first response was really about national governments, and then you had a second round of some regional organizations trying to come up with some responses in a later stage, right? And then just moving forward towards the end, I think what you can look at more concretely at the EU-LAC side, so at the interregional side, is that the EU has given some initial support to Latin American countries in the context of pandemic. For instance, in 2020, the Commission allocated almost 1 billion euros to help most vulnerable countries and populations across Latin America and the Caribbean. And at some point, that number actually reached 2 billion euros. The EU also and its member states exported almost 40 million doses to 12 Latin American Caribbean countries and donated more than 60 million doses to another 12 countries in the region. But on the other hand, if you look at CELAC recent declarations, you see how CELAC is very much concerned, or its member states concerned with how COVAX criteria and how that those doses came really later in the process of vaccination, and there's a lot of criticism to sort of the key, right? So Western countries, they first make sure that they had enough vaccines to themselves, and then they start thinking about developing countries, right? So, and that also explains why you have different waves across the globe in terms of reaching different peaks in the numbers of deaths, and also later on the numbers of vaccination coming out. And just to conclude, right, I think it's looking at this partnership and trying to understanding what's the impact of the pandemic in and beyond the pandemic, right? How the partnership has been affected by these events, and departing from the idea that there's multiple and contrasting responses to the pandemic coming from different countries and region organizations in the two regions, I think we can highlight perhaps three challenges for ongoing future EU-LAC relations. The first is the existence of nationalist and sovereignist view of how handling not only the pandemic, but other topics on the global agenda. And I think this actually has a crucial impact on how you can move forward interregional cooperation towards a more effective cooperation, which is usually the criticism that EU-LAC relations have been receiving, right? So there's a lot of nice declarations on how both regions shared a lot of stuff, norms, principles, tradition, history, right? Even colonization, if you think about how this goes even deeper in the region. But then again, right, how can you translate those sort of common values and traditions into concrete interregional action, right? So the pandemic sort of bring us some evidence of these challenges. Quite connected to this, the second point is about the rising contestation of multilateral institutions from some EU and LAC countries. I also think this affects rising skepticism around regional institutions, not only in Latin America, as we have many cases, but also in Europe. If you think about some countries such as Hungary and Poland, in many respects, right, challenging some of constitutional principles of the European Union in recent years. And I think this really has a key impact on interregional agenda, especially because you have internal challenges of certain values of those organizations, and then how can you come up with shared norms when you look at EU-LAC relations. And the last one is that if you look at over time, and that's perhaps explained why we didn't have stronger responses in terms of health cooperation, is that EU-LAC relations is still pretty much characterized by a trade liberalization as the main pillar of interregional relations, right? So European Commission's technocratic autonomy somehow favors this process, but it also means that many EU-LAC topics, such as health, are not really much on the radar as they should be, right? And that also maybe explains why there's not much deeper talks on interregional cooperation in terms of health, apart from donation of vaccines and money from the least developed countries in Latin America. And then you also obviously have this more north-south and very much asymmetric relationship that Andrea mentioned in the beginning. And I think another dimension that has also a lot to do with Atanasio's exposition. I think we also should think about to what extent we should also strengthen non-executive EU-LAC dimensions as a sort of bringing more legitimacy to the whole interregional cooperation, right? So there are interparliamentary relations via EU-LAC, for example, and there's some channels to the dialogue amongst civil society, business, and academic sectors when you look at EU-LAC relations, but then they are completely out of the intergovernmental radars. And as we know, the summits and these are the political agenda, it's completely on the hands of presidents and heads of governments of both sides. So I think sort of just to conclude, so I think overcoming these issues together is crucial for EU and LAC countries to intend to further deepen their interregional ties in a post-pandemic world, right? So I think this is it for my part. Thank you again for inviting and for accepting the panel, the paper, and I'm also looking forward to reading your papers in the near future. Thank you very much. On to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Again, I think this is a short presentation of two full special issues of two journals. I hope we have more time to discuss all these points raised later on. I'm sure we'll have. But I think now for the point of the event, I mean, we have then a final Q&A. And I'd like to already put some questions to the three of you, which I think they bring a lot, those elements, again, not only on these dilemmas within the regions, but also the global level, because one of the elements that Bruno brought now in the end, it's making reference, of course, to what we can talk about, the crisis of multilateralism in the world. So be it within the EU or Latin America or ULAC, but of course we see that that's a worldwide phenomenon, be it the UN level, but also other regional organizations in Asia or Africa, and multilateralism as such. I mean, we do have a war if we really think about going on, and yeah, and it's taking a long time, and maybe it's not even being portrayed as the level of gravity as it should. Now, so what it means, all these institutions that we have, multilateral institutions. So I think that all the points you're raising, I think they really call attention to this more structural global phenomenon that we are living, this moment of crisis of democracy, liberalism, but also multilateralism, and the EU and Latin America are, of course, in this moment. So they reflect the problems. I mean, and you all mentioned, also including the EU, the responses, the war responses, the EU much more if you compare with Latin American regional organizations, but definitely very below the level of expectation that we could have, especially in a crisis as it was COVID, that it is clear a crisis that call for cooperation, because this virus was geopoliticized. I mean, so it's unbelievable how even a crisis like that, instead of really forging and pushing cooperation, set the limits for it of nationalism and in the case of Latin America. So I just want to put in terms of question here also that was brought by Claudia and Bruno, but of course, I mean, we were under Bolsonaro government, a government that was denialist from the beginning, who was almost against, who played against any kind of response, being it regional or even national. And what we could see is that when there was any kind of response was below that governmental level, and what was mentioned also by Bruno, the UNASUR. So a lot of the initiatives that were done was, I would argue, some leftovers of experiences of cooperation. So we could hear about Fiocruz, which was one of the, it's a Brazilian institute of research and also producing of vaccination, who started being mobilized not only locally, but then in Brazil and in the region, because of some leftovers of that experience of cooperation in the case of Ecuador. And so we see that there was a chance for those institutions to act, and they didn't at the level they could, with the exception, as you mentioned, of SIC and CARICOM. So so one of the questions is that to what extent this denialism, and I think both Claudia and Bruno, Bolsonaro in the Americas, we had Bolsonaro and Trump, so that was key. I mean, it's the biggest countries, and together with Mexico, who also had a delay, to push for any kind of collective response. And so the question is that, and we're still living that, hopefully in Brazil, not for too long, but I mean, at the societal level, we know that these movements are there, also in the US, with Trumpism and Bolsonarism. So what is this denialism? Because that was key, the denialism of science, the argument that, so many stories about the virus. So to what extent this is still actually a problem to cooperate? Because if you don't even agree on what is going on at a very basic level of science, I mean, how can you move? And this is also in the climate change. So the question for you both, and of course, if UNASUR, for Bruno, UNASUR, since you mentioned it, maybe also Guilherme, to what extent UNASUR could have done something different? Would it have done, it's a counterfactual exercise, but we had a positive experience of ISAGS and UNASUR in other cases, and but the institutions were completely gone. So do you see any chance that for health to be after COVID recovered? I mean, this more thick institutionality after Bolsonaro or after yeah, I don't know actually after what, but at least I like to think that after Bolsonaro there could be some movement towards that. And also for you both, why then CARICOM and SICA were so more successful after all? I mean, there's something with the cooperation. You mentioned that the CARICOM is very specific. There's a lot of cooperation with the EU in other previous agreements, and SICA, there was also some international cooperation. So do you think that when these external actors like channeled cooperation through the organization, then that strengthened SICA and CARICOM, while for Mercosur and the others, it was not, and also CELAC. And then also for Claudia, I mean, this research about how death is dealt with in regional organization, which I find very original, really, when I think this is very important, because in all these crises and COVID most of all, I mean, we were dealing with, we always talk about, of course, the vulnerabilities and so on. And you call attention to this element, like how cooperation, some issues were never dealt before in regional cooperation. And here you had a huge, or as you mentioned, desaparecidos was the topic of not having the body, and how can that was dealt with at the global and regional level at some point. So I find this extremely important, because how you dealt with that, there's a lot of cultural aspects and how we could mourn. And I remember that now, of course, we are aware it's a month of the worst, but this issue that you couldn't even see the person, you cannot even go to a hospital, you know that your family member or friend was dying alone in a hospital. I mean, that's really a tragedy at the scale that it happened. And so it's a collective trauma. Do you see that this could be in the human rights discussions about, in the case of Chile and Argentina especially, but in Latin America, the transitions, I mean, how you handle with deaths in such a scale, like not only localized. And I stop here. I have so many points. I really hope we continue collaborating. I just want to open again, if you have any other questions for them, and from the attendees, I don't see any here. Otherwise, Dimitris, please.
I have a question about the, well, mainly about Guilherme's and Bruno's presentations, and how to do with the fragmentation, because I noticed there's a lot of fragmentation of regional institutions in Latin America, and you have this on top. I mean, in EU we have nation states, member states, and the EU governance. It seems you have an added layer where, or rather, you lack the top layer. You have many layers in between, so many regional, different regional organizations. And I wanted to ask, I mean, you gave some first impressions, but how this fragmentation has impeded cooperation in the region and overlapping, and even Guilherme, you talk about a couple of organizations, CARICOM, and I don't remember that one, being more effective. I mean, did they do different things? Did they do the same things? Because they could be effective, but perhaps they could be even more effective if they will, between them, they cooperated as well. And also the fragmentation, it was mentioned by Bruno in relation to the EU. I mean, if the EU has 10 different actors to talk with, obviously, this is not going to be a very effective way of the regional cooperation. And you, by the way, just to mention this, because it was mentioned by Bruno about the health aspect, in Europe, despite the very advanced level of regional integration, health is still a national competency. So it's, I mean, the Commission, you're right, again, the Commission, focuses more on trade because that's its competence. I mean, it's really, it's basic competence, exclusive. It has mainly on two areas: competition of the internal market and trade policy with other actors. So this is it's where you can talk with some authority, and definitely this kind of limits the avenues of cooperation, I think.
Thank you. So I think we can start in the order, Guilherme, then Claudia, and then Bruno.
Okay. Well, thank you for the questions. And there are some really difficult and questions, and I'll try to address all of them. I will begin with what is different in CARICOM that made it have better response. And well, I'd like to highlight 3 key points. First, I think the experience. CARICOM has a history of dealing and cooperating in health issues. There are some nature characteristics from the region. They are islands, and it's really fragile. There are too many fragilities on the domestic health systems, and this kind of situation forced them to cooperate. So I think that's one of the key points to understand why it was more effective. And the other point was the European Union leadership. Again, historically, European Union has had a leadership in financing and giving help to them, and I think it has made the difference because they have had an input of resource that they don't have individually. So I think those 2 points are the main, the key points to understand CARICOM's how CARICOM faced the pandemic. Now about the fragmentation that Dimitri is asked, and trying to connect into the Andrea's questions about UNASUR, I think the fragmentation or the overlapping, for on the one hand, it could be an stimulus to exchange information, experience between the organizations, and I think UNASUR may have had this function, especially when we analyze how UNASUR faced the influenza crisis some years ago, and well, some kind of coordination. But I think in the case of the pandemic, the overlapping, instead of stimulating the exchange, made the organization more isolated. And in adding to it, there was a lack of leadership. And in this case, Brazil and the United States, I think they were the main actors isolating themselves, and then there was no leadership to try to build some kind of cooperation. So I think the paper that the role that European Union has had in CARICOM, there was no one to do it in South American or in North American. So I think this is a key point to look and to think about the future. They need to a leadership. I think that's it.
Thank you, Guilherme. Claudia?
Yeah, may I go ahead? Thank you so much for your questions, Andrea. As soon as I finished my presentation, you suggested that we shall look into the numbers, the death rates here in the Americas. And in terms of our numbers, we are quite close in terms of cases. We are quite close to Germany and France, for instance. But when it goes to mortality, you know, we could not be compared, you know, beyond the Americas, except for India, as you mentioned. So the conversion of cases into deaths in American countries is really impressive. And Brazil and the United States, you know, call our attention most. I think it's completely connected with the denialism personalized in Bolsonaro and Trump. So, of course, there is a strong relation. But I think that recurring to this research and this, you know, deep studying to our political history in the Americas, I think we also have a very strong repertoire to combat denialism. You know, the movements of Don't Forget, We Will Not Forget, or the movements, the historical political movements, to ask for the truth, considering our coups all through the history. I think that they are also part of an opportunity of framing what we face in terms of mass atrocity, in terms of transitional justice. So we are already to see how this could be, you know, conducted, and how our history of the present can be made, assuming our, you know, our legacies, our important legacies. And I think that the Organization of American States, with all its limits, is really connected with this, you know, ideal of making some reparations and making some responsibles accountable, you know, for mass atrocities. I think that we also have an emergent ideal of an international human rights connected to the right to mourn. So as you said, the point of the desaparecidos, or the disappeared, is really connected to, you know, an open process, and to a certain extent, the global geography of death that COVID-19 recreated in the Americas, you know, put us into this, you know, this very moment, because we were also obliged, as you mentioned, to mourn without the body, to mourn in the doubt of whose body was really there. You know, there are many new discussions in terms of transnational death, considering the virtualization of death. So is it possible to virtualize death, you know, those virtual ceremonies, or, you know, how can it be handled? I think that there is much to be explored in terms of, you know, our connection as a discipline, international relations, with all this discussion, but also with this movement that OAS really did. You know, we started our research more optimistic than we compared to the end of it. But I think that the documents and what they conceive can put, you know, the international human rights regime into contact with death, and not the, you know, the only or the solely perspective of life, you know, because many lives are, you know, are striving to being lived, you know, and we are talking about a dying process on a daily basis in our region. So I think it's it. For now, I tried to react to some of your comments, and I hope we can, you know, go ahead with this discussion in later opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. So now, Bruno, if you can have our final words, it will be always our final words of the webinar as well. So please.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. Yeah, I'll try to be as quickly as possible, so we try to end up this before 2 p.m. In Brazil. And yeah, I mean, to what extent denialism has impacted regional interregional cooperation, and if this is still a problem, I would say, yeah, it impacted significantly. I try to address partially that on my paper. And I think, yeah, it explains, right? It brings this epidemiologic nationalism and to on the table, and that is one of the elements that explain why regional and interregional cooperation was really hard, especially in the initial years of the pandemic. Is this still a problem? I think so, because even though Trump is not leading the US anymore, but Bolsonaro is still in place in Brazil, and we're still having elections next month. And you also have some examples in Europe that also from governments that may have a different idea of regionalism and means, right? And also the values behind EU-LAC interregional cooperations that are traditionally based on trade liberalization, as I mentioned, although this is very problematic. but also in terms of human rights, and Claudia was talking about a lot about this, right? And protection of democracy and the rule of law, which is an ongoing issue both in Latin America now and obviously in Central Europe as well. And yeah, I mean, and yeah, second one is UNASUR could have done something different. I mean, in principle, yes, but then again, regionalism in Latin America is pretty much dependent on intergovernmental negotiations. So that also depends on who is leading member states, and especially key member states such as Brazil, such as Mexico, such as Argentina, such as Chile. So Chile tried alone actually to do something and try to use PROSUR as a new organization would, in theory, would replace UNASUR and try to put forward some agenda on health for the whole South America. They didn't make it, so it's an example of how when there's non-existent levels of institutionalizations, that's not much a capacity to make a difference in some regional policies, and I think that was the case there. I think UNASUR could have played a different role, but then also depends on the political configurations, and in a scenario that we had denialist presidents out there and lack of leadership, then not really, right? So I think UNASUR could play out some role, bringing some technocratic consensus on what we should do in terms of health. But then OPAS has done that, and they also were marginalized, right? So I don't know. And Fiocruz has done that as well, Instituto Butantan in Brazil and other organizations, and they were challenged by the government, right? Yeah, CARICO and SICA clearly were more effective. I agree fully with Guilherme on that. I think level institutionalization again played a key role on the responses. Institutional legacies, experiences, and even learning also is a relevant dimension to explore. So that also explains what happened in Africa and Asia, right? So history of Ebola reactions and SARS in Asia, Ebola in Africa, they kind of explain why some regional organizations in Africa and Asia had quick responses and even tougher responses than you've seen in Europe and Latin America. And that also explains why in Europe and in the Americas, right, you had such a overweighted size of deaths compared to health population, right? So there's one presidential candidate in Brazil that is often saying that, right? So Brazil responds to 3% of the global population, but then 11% of the global deaths in COVID came from Brazil, right? So what explains that if it's not denialism? Because Brazil has much more health capacity in the health systems than in many poor countries across the world, but still, right? A lot of people died here, and that has a lot to do with what Claudia discussed. And yeah, the last element is also about support of external actors, and then it comes the EU in this sense, and that has a lot to do with Dimitri's questions, right? So how can you understand regional fragmentation in Latin America if there's more layers in Latin American fragmentations than you have in the EU, right? Obviously, the EU is not the only regional organization in Europe, but you have EFTA, you have Council of Europe, you have many other organizations, you have NATO in terms of security, but then you can see different sizes and different levels of fragmentations, and I think overlapping regions is much more explicit in Latin America than it is in Europe, and that explains why you have this divergence, you have forum shopping, you have also confusion behind extra regional actors trying to engage with the region, and that is the case of the European Union, right? And that also perhaps explain how it's really hard to cooperate with Latin America when you don't have really intra-region convergence, right? So you have CELAC, but it's actually one of the least institutionalized organizations in Latin America, right? OAS is much more stronger in that sense, but then includes the North of America, and then there's a lot of problems behind that. But then again, yeah, how right extra regional actors trying to engage with the region. I think it's interesting to look at how China is doing that. Right? So China has a specific form with CELAC, but they also privilege bilateral relations with countries through commercial and investments on infrastructure. Now you have the Belt and Road Initiative and all of that. So they are incorporating specific Latin American countries on that. And yeah, I'll stop here because we are out of 2 o'clock. But thank you so much for the questions. There's a lot of debate, interesting that we can move on with that in future activities. Thank you very much for the invitation, and that's it for my part. And have a nice week for everyone.
Thank you, Bruno. I think we'll try then now to conclude at 2 o'clock. It's been a pleasure to discuss all of that, and I hope we have other occasions to meet and to discuss all these regional organizations, and hopefully now with the COVID, the peak of the COVID gone, even if we do have other challenges and crises and so on, I must say, I think you agree with me, COVID was pretty hard. So I'm glad that we are now discussing this when we are in this moment, and so I just wanted to thank Dimitris now for this joint initiative. Actually, now you had the idea, so I think it was a great idea. I think it's great to exchange that and to do that. We are part of this interregionalism, interregional relations. I mean, we are academics exchanging our research and our ideas, and I think it's a very important part of it, exactly to counteract this excessive intergovernmentalism, and I think we have smaller spaces, of course, comparatively, but I think it's very important. I'm happy that we have in the context of the Jean Monnet network, but also here, wide-wise here, the colleagues from Brazil who responded to the call and who are working with these. Again, the same there now for region and periphery. So I hope we can just enlarge our group of conversation in these topics. And I give you the last word, Dimitri, so as you can really close our webinar.
No, but I would just like to thank everybody for participating today, and thank you for going ahead with the initial idea and making this joint call a reality, for organizing this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So have a nice evening for those in Greece, and afternoon for all of us have lunch